From Lewis in the Black Horse Pub. Good morning. It's Friday, the 12th of April, 2024. When I was a boy, that was a date that used to appear in comics like The Eagle, as the Mekong came in from unknown planets to be taken on by Dan Dare. It was way in the future where it's arrived. It's got me confused all to hell. Okay, when you're getting on a bit, you don't handle things as well as you used to. You get little things wrong. And it's bloody frustrating when everybody around you, who seems to be 20, 25 at the very most, get as much wrong as you do. It's very, very, very worrying.
Yes, hello, Miriam.
And particularly when you don't know how to put it right. There you see, I just hit a button, expecting one thing to come up, and did it? No. Not a bit of it. And I don't know where to get it. And that's on top of, have you ever seen that Keystone Cops thing where they get a barrel of bricks and they lose the bricks so that the counterweight on the other end of the rope comes down and hits them on the head. And then swings into a piece of wood, which takes it up again. So the more that they do, the more it goes. Well, being in television can be a bit like that. You wake up and you think, oh, it's Friday. Wonderful. Terrific series of programs. Last day of the week, I'm feeling full of the joys of spring. Then you open up your emails, and one after another, you find that you haven't got a series of terrific programs. One video won't work, which means it's jammed access to the other videos. That you drop one of the cameras and you don't know whether you've actually killed it or not. And so it goes on. And I'm amazed that I'm here. I'm amazed that we're here. We just about made it. But if you think life in this lane, fast though it may be, is easy, think again. Go and be a grocer or a bricklayer or anything, but never ever consider going into television. Never ever. Because unless you've got a strong heart, you'll never last. Ever. You're looking at something like a small miracle. If you hear a crash, it's because I pulled one cord too many. Ada is here, doing her best to look after me, hearing me swear, stomp my little feet, do all sorts of things that I shouldn't, purely out of frustration. Anyway, the first thing that you'll want to know is what the hell the weather is today. I mean, it's going to reach a heady 16 degrees. 16 degrees! Wow. And yet the air, strangely, is cold. It's supposed to be sunny all day. No rain whatsoever. Well, there's no rain, but sunny it ain't.
See you on Monday, kid.
Okay, darling.
Bye-bye.
Ada is leaving the building. No. Sunny it ain't. It's cloudy. Not thick cloud, but it's cloudy. Is the sun going to burn through? Well, you can have a little flutter on that. As indeed I expect you will, because everybody always does on the Grand National, which comes up tomorrow. So sunny and a moderate breeze today. Tomorrow, sunny spells. Still 16 degrees tomorrow. But starting off a little cooler. Starting off at 7. And when it starts cooler, 9 times out of 10, the rest of the day becomes not as warm as it might. Let's put it that way. Parkinson's, mouth, jockey bar, coffee, all meant as therapy. And all meant to lift my spirits, which, believe me, were at a bit of a low earlier. Now, assuming that we get the crossword, or the cross puzzle right, which is Miracle, on this program next week, we shall have the delightful Rosie Hayes joining me. Rosie is a very experienced journalist. In fact, one of the top in the field. And she also, like me, her namesake, if you like, no relation, Hayes and Hayes, have traveled the world. I worked with Rosie in Moscow. But prior to that, she had real triumphs in the early days of Cuba, when Fidel Castro was still in charge. One of the most successful revolutionaries of all time. He was never toppled. And the infamous Bay of Pigs, the American-inspired fight back after he'd taken over, it was a complete and utter fiasco. Uncoordinated, unfulfilled. The Castro's forces thoroughly beat them back. One small contact I had with that revolution, very small, was that there were two old Hurricanes from the Second World War parked out at Vancouver Airport. One day, after sitting there for a long time, they were test flown, and the next day they'd gone. And they went to take part in the Bay of Pigs. It is sort of eerie to see something like that. Something like an airplane. It's become the norm for you. You look at it and you think nothing of it. Suddenly it's gone. Because it's gone to war. Well, hardly war. It's gone to battle. I assume that the poor thing ended up shot down. Certainly it wasn't on the winning side, let's put it that way. Anyway, Rosie made her name in Castro country, and a very fine journalist she is. She runs her own little news agency now, YN UK, Your News UK, and a very fine job she does with it. But she's agreed to come and do Friday mornings, early Friday mornings on Mirador, and we look forward to welcoming her. And I must say that, almost without exception, Mirador's team are either very experienced people in journalism or broadcasting, or both, along with people like Phil Meredith, for instance, who has now retired after a very successful career as a barrister. So it's a very experienced team, a very good team. So expect Rosie in this slot next week. Should we take a look at the papers? Yes, let's. Oh dear. There we are. Newspaper headlines. And it's all about Starmer, most headlines this morning. Starmer, UK nuclear deterrent is safe in my hands. In a landmark article for the Mail, Sakir vows unshakable commitment to Trident and to build the new generation of subs here. There are a variety of stories on Friday's papers today, but the Daily Mail features Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer, who says he has an unshakable belief in the UK's nuclear deterrent and that he is utterly committed to our nation's defences. The paper describes Sir Keir's stance as a major shift from that of his predecessor, Jeremy Corbyn. The Eye. Starmer. Labour will hike UK defence spending amid threat from China and Russia. In an interview for The Eye, my gosh, he put himself around yesterday, didn't he? Sir Keir says Labour would increase military spending to 2.5% of GDP if it wins the next general election, and that defence would be the number one issue for his government. The paper says he is also committed to building 4 new nuclear submarines at the Barrow-in-Furness shipyard in Cumbria. Well, that'll be welcome news for the workers in the north. The Guardian. Labour is warned over loss of urban seats in election. Well, The Guardian reports that Labour has been told it is at risk of losing as many as a dozen of its main target seats because of previously loyal voters in urban areas turning away from the party. The paper says the pollsters have warned that some Muslims have been angered by the party stance on Gaza, while younger progressive voters feel it is not focusing enough on climate change. One senior advisor tells the paper, at the moment, it looks like it doesn't matter as our poll lead is so wide, but it could hurt if they narrow and those voters don't come back. If they narrow, they mean the figures between the parties. The FT, the Financial Times, it's got a picture of the Chinese guard on it. Tory election hopes hit as forecasts of interest rate cuts are scaled back. All right, there we go. The economy again. Traders have scaled back expectations of an interest rate cut this year after figures showed United States inflation stayed unexpectedly high, delivering a blow to Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and his hopes of going into the election on the back of cheaper mortgages and lower taxes. The paper says the government had been hoping the Bank of England would start cutting rates well before an election, and quotes conservative officials admitting that the United States data could impact the party's election strategy. Indeed. Indeed. The Daily Express. Bring to an end triple lock pension injustice for millions. Who's that? That's the Daily Express. The Express leads with a call for an end to what it describes as a triple lock pension injustice for millions. The paper says less than 1/3 of pensioners received an 8.5% hike on their income that had been due this week. Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I had a letter saying how much I was going to get. And it seemed to me to be a very reasonable increase. I didn't work out the percentage. But I'm happy if it goes up by tuppence. In this silly game, broadcast journalism, I live on the edge anyway. So what's the difference? The Daily Telegraph. Border Force to blame for fake stamps. We're into the blame game again. Royal Mail has said Border Force is to blame for the number of counterfeit stamps entering the UK from China and accused the government of not doing enough to tackle the issue. That's according to the Telegraph. It comes after a report in the paper said 4 major Chinese suppliers were offering to print and deliver up to 1 million stamps a week for as little as 4p each. Royal Mail executive David Gold tells the paper, if these stamps are coming in from abroad, people's obvious question will be, should Border Force just be stopping them? I think that's reaching a little bit, but still, there we go. I would have thought it was a discredited post office that should be stopping them. Still. The Daily Mirror. Here is one big story that appears in every paper, but not as a headline. Infamous OJ dead at 76. The Daily Mirror leads on the death of OJ Simpson from cancer at the age of 76. Simpson, a former American football star, was controversially cleared of the 1994 murder of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown, and her friend Ron Goldman. The paper says the acquittal came despite the overwhelming evidence against him, and that few were last night mourning him. Interesting character, OJ, because I remember as a college star, he was picked by the Buffalo Bills, who were the lowest on the totem pole. And the American system of recruiting players is that out of college, the lowest team, in other words, the worst performing team, gets the first pick. And the idea is to eventually level up teams so that you always got them competitive. You don't, for instance, have Buffalo always at the bottom. And they chose O.J. Simpson, who I think played a couple of seasons for them before he moved on to bigger people. And then I think he appeared in a Super Bowl, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, I remember turning on the television and watching what initially was not identified, but that TV cameras from helicopters were following a Jeep going along the highway with the hint that there was somebody naughty in there. And indeed, it turned out to be O.J. Simpson. Then I happened to be visiting Canada and drove down into the States for a little while on the day that the verdict was to be delivered. And there was betting all the way around that despite, as it says, overwhelming evidence, he would be found not guilty. And sure enough, he was found not guilty. It's all to do with the government's desire to appease the black population. suggestions from that nation's black leaders that he was being picked on. And the evidence was absolutely straightforward. Anyway, he's now met his maker. The Sun, long-time double murder accuser Caitlyn Jenner says, "Good riddance." The Sun's headline quotes a social media post reacting to the death from reality star Caitlyn Jenner, who at the time of the killing, O.J. Simpson, was married to Brown's best friend, Kris Jenner. Good riddance, it reads. Well, that's all inside stuff, really. I was married to so-and-so, and he was affected by this murder, etc., etc. We get that on everything. Metro. J.K. Rowling and the Goblet of Ire. Author J.K. Rowling has said she cannot forgive the stars of the Harry Potter films for their support of the trans rights movement. This is in the Metro. It comes after a landmark review found children accessing gender care services have been let down by a lack of research and medical interventions performed on the basis of remarkably weak evidence. Actors Daniel Radcliffe, Emma Watson, and Rupert Grint have all publicly criticized Rowling's comments on the issue, responding to a fan on social media who suggested the stars might apologize, safe in the knowledge you will forgive them. Rowling responded, "Not safe, I'm afraid." I must say that traditionally stars, film stars and so on, who are often play wise men. They're as thick as two short planks. And they are the first to make comments at election times, controversial legislation times, and so on and so forth. If only they would just keep on playing their role, which they do very well, the better. I don't know, frankly. I can't get excited about this gender issue, but that's because of age. I don't doubt one moment that it's very important, and it is taking up a lot of time in people's lives right now, and actually in the agenda of the nation. But it is a fact that, of course, because they are who they are, is they get a lot of time given to them and a lot of attention given to them when they come out and make a statement. But you watch some of these shows where they get a star on, and where the host, interviewer, anchor, whatever you want to call him, has got just a little bit of nous, and they completely unwind. And somebody like Emma Thompson, for instance, she can't help keep it. What a wonderful actress! Absolutely fantastic actress. I just love her acting. But the moment she actually utters any statement, because she's got every right to, that's a democracy. I'm not denying her right or that of Daniel Radcliffe and so on. But the point is that they make these statements knowing full well that they'll be widely reported. And therefore, what they do is they sound as if they know. And a lot of people say, "Oh, if Emma says so, if Daniel says so." Well, that's all nonsense. That's all rubbish. But then again, we don't think very carefully. We rabbit on about a democracy, but most people don't really care. they would make the same decisions and make the same protestations if we were in an autocracy. So in that sense, it doesn't make any difference. But taking away our freedom to be sick, that's something else again. That is something else. And I can understand J.K. Rowling being upset at her stars, her fellow stars, turning on her. Too late to take their roles away. The Times. Consultants accused of covering up fatal flaws. The Times reports that a whistleblower has claimed a group of senior hospital consultants suppressed warnings about patient safety years before police were called in to investigate alleged medical negligence. The paper says neurosurgeon Mansour Faroukhi was fired from Royal Sussex County Hospital, where police are now investigating 105 cases of alleged negligence, including 40 deaths after blowing the whistle 17 times between 2018 and 2021. It quotes him claiming his warnings were ignored and or deliberately concealed. Well, I have to say, my wife was in there 10 years ago. I've been in 2 or 3 times, not for very long. And if there were things that were worrying me about safety, I didn't notice them. But then I wasn't looking. And even then, even if I was looking, I wouldn't know what I was looking for. I was quite impressed with people. Of course, the only thing is that, as throughout the country, I was on a gurney. I think that's what they call them, a gurney, in the hospital corridor, rather than in a ward or even in a thing with the curtains pulled around. That is a weakness. That is a weakness indeed. But it's happening in our own backyard, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. My consultant for my Parkinson's comes out of that hospital. I've got an appointment with her. First time I've seen her. We'll have seen her in 6 months. At the beginning of next month, I'll have to ask her, am I at risk being in your presence? I laugh. But of course, it's a very serious issue. The thing is that it's the same with anything. Ask people if they're, or even their sector, is below par, is not doing the job properly, is creating danger. And of course they go, ha ha, of course not, of course not. And then 6 months, a year later, it comes out that indeed they were. So, so the Daily Star, it concentrates on tomorrow's Grand National. Slightly long odds, but to win the Grand National, legendary rider Ruby Walsh's secret tips to our man. And the Daily Star says former Grand National winner Ruby Walsh has revealed his top secret tips that could help a reporter at the paper win the race for himself. Dear. as dear old Ruby. I never met the man, but a friend of mine who was the TV director for Racing UK took him to his London club, where the Irish maitre d' couldn't do enough for them. Couldn't do enough. It is. My friend said that the drinks came all afternoon without anything going onto the account. Let's just take a quick look at a little deeper into a couple of those stories. The Times reports that teachers, MPs, and campaigners have accused technology company Meta of taking a highly irresponsible approach to child safety after it lowered the minimum age for WhatsApp from 16 to 13. A member of the Commons Education Select Committee describes the decision as reckless. The paper says there are concerns the messaging app is fostering cyberbullying, sleep deprivation, and the spread of harmful content among children. I'm never sure with these things whether in fact there's any fact to the charges. I can remember when I was 13 or 14 and television first came, and it was widespread belief that watching television would make your eyes bulge, did all sorts of other things to you, and numbed your brain and so on. Well, I think some of it is true, but not numbing your brain because of any sort of radiation stuff and so on, but just the standard of the programs. Comments by Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer feature in two papers. He told the Eye that he would increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP if he becomes Prime Minister. He said a more dangerous world made it necessary to spend more on the military. And in an article for the Daily Mail, Sir Keir promises what he calls a triple lock on the UK's nuclear weapons, to build at least 4 new nuclear submarines in Barrow-in-Furness to maintain a continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent and to deliver all future upgrade needed. In a separate editorial, the paper says defence has historically been Labour's weak spot, but not today. It points to a recent poll showing that the party is now more trusted to keep the country safe than the Tories. Not a bit surprised. According to The Guardian, Labour is at risk of losing a number of its target seats at the next general election because Muslims and progressive voters are turning away from the party, angered by its stances on Gaza and the climate. The paper says polls currently suggest Labour is on track to win by a landslide, but that some insiders fear that if the margins narrow, the loss of some of the party's core vote could prove the difference between a hung parliament and an outright majority. Oh, that's interesting. The Financial Times says Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's hopes of going into the election on the back of lower taxes and cheaper mortgages have suffered a blow because of higher than expected inflation in the United States. Financial markets now expect the Bank of England to cut interest rates just twice this year, rather than 6 times, as had been anticipated in January. The paper says that's pushing up the cost of government borrowing, potentially reducing the government's scope for pre-election tax cuts in the autumn. And there's a photograph of O.J. Simpson, the American football star who was controversially cleared of killing his ex-wife and her friend, has died aged 76. Well, there you are. Everything looks normal out there, doesn't it? Cars going by, people going to work. The historical spot across the road still there. Well, you see, they just had to stop at a light. Now flooding through, and why not? Right. Well, that's let's see, is it 8:42? I've been rabbiting on for God knows how long, and 8:42 is it's 20 to 9, isn't it? I'm not quite sure what we've got coming up, but what I'm going to do is I promised to show episode 5 of a documentary. So if I can just find it, which I quite often can't. Let's see. There we go. Episode 5. Sit back and enjoy the bloody past of a tiny town. The story of Lewis and its high street. Toodle tip a moment.
Bloody Lewis. Hi. Bloodletting wasn't confined to fierce battles and the tilting gentry. There were lots of naughty people around in Lewis over the centuries. And the good citizens of the town made sure they paid for their crimes. The Saxons kicked up a bit of a fuss after the Normans took over. And the new masters of the town got a bit heavy with them. The Saxons had used hanging as their way of dealing with major crime. The Normans also thought that was a decent way to get rid of naughty folk, and they kept the gallows as a punishment. Although the records of people being hanged in Lewis aren't too plentiful, the number of people going to the gallows after 1066 increased considerably. Until the mid-1600s, felons were locked up in the castle, then taken down the road a bit to this place, Gallows Bank. There is evidence that this was where the gallows stood from Saxon times to the mid-19th century. When hangings were no longer done in public, hangings didn't stop. They just weren't done in public. They were moved to Lewis Prison. But they were public until 1868, and huge crowds would turn up just to watch somebody being hanged. In fact, the modern term Gala Day comes from such occasions, previously known as Gallows Day. Chasing around Lewis can be a tiring affair, so I sometimes take a breather and come to this little corner of a park near the centre of Lewis. It's called the Knot Garden. I had no idea what a knot garden was until I spoke to a gardening expert. It's a garden of symmetrical design, as you can see. These breathers give me a chance to think about some of the stories we reported on, thought about, perhaps even enjoyed. I've just come from Lewis Prison. I've reported many times on the Russian prisoners held in the old naval prison. It's hard to forget them because there's a monument erected to them in the churchyard of one of our churches, St. John sub Castro. These prisoners seem to have overshadowed the 300 Finnish prisoners who were held in the new Lewis prison. They were from the same Crimea War in 1853. They fared better than their Russian counterparts in the old naval prison because they were repatriated quite quickly, and history seems to have forgotten them. One of the Russian prisoners went over the wall and caused a nationwide manhunt. When he was eventually found, he was in a pub just next door to the prison having a tot of rum. He'd forgotten just how nice it was to have that glass before his bedtime, so he went and found one. Norman justice was pretty fierce and pretty swift. But they did introduce an early version of the 12-man jury system. So the baddies of yesteryear were given some sort of chance. While hanging was the flavour of the day, there was also a way of avoiding being strung up if you chose trial by ordeal. I must say, I think that trial by ordeal was thought up by a mischievous bookmaker. Certainly the odds were heavily stacked against the victim. There was trial by fire, trial by water, and trial by combat. By fire, the accused had to pick up a red-hot poker or bar. If the wound healed, then the verdict was innocent of all charges. But if infection set in, then guilt was proved, and he returned to the noose. By water, the accused was bound hand and foot, thrown into the pond and told to swim. No breaststroke, just bubbles. Innocent. Sorry about that. The ducking stool was a more genteel version for ladies, but the results were much the same. Float, guilty, off to the gallows. And if you were well bred, you had the best odds of the lot. Noblemen would fight often to the death in combat with their accuser. The winner of the battle would be considered to be the one that was right. It was 1215 when trial by ordeal was replaced by trial by jury. 12 good men and true. The castle as a prison wasn't a huge success. A number of prisoners went in through the front door and then decamped via the back to the river in the hope of catching a boat out of town. When the economy of Lewis, usually robust and lucrative, became depressed in the 14th century, there was an epidemic of less serious crime. People became desperate during these hard times, and in 1396 the parson of St. John's was charged with robbery from Hamsey Church, but was later granted a king's pardon. The stocks were deemed to be a lesser punishment. On one occasion in Lewis, in the 13th century, the bishop ordered a knight to be punished by carrying the stocks through the town streets and into a church, because the knight had dared to throw a member of the clergy into his dungeon. The Lewis stocks stood next to the gallows. I don't think this was by accident. The Normans figured that the sight of ghoulish punishment would act as a deterrent. Sitting in the stocks would have given lesser villains an opportunity to view dead men dangling from the rope, bodies rotting in the gibbet, or people hobbling around, limbs severed, mutilated as a punishment. It's a bit uncomfortable sitting here in the stocks. I wouldn't want to spend a whole night here. It would make a man a bit stiff on a chill evening. But my main punishment was being kept out of the pub all night with nothing to drink but water. But the main punishment was ridicule, of course. In those days, a fate worse than death. The stocks outlasted the gallows as a public spectacle. They didn't disappear until 1872. Some historians claim that this punishment has never been removed from the law books, and indeed there are still some American states where being consigned to the stocks remains on the statutes. So tourists beware. Having cabbages thrown in your face, your feet tickled, and spending a cold night with legs locked up is hardly the holiday of a lifetime. At last, I'm out of the stocks. Time for a drink. Ordeal by beer. Bliss. Always fancied myself as a knight in shining armor. Unfortunately, I've never found a damsel in distress to rescue. So I rather think that I would have been on the side of the peasants when they revolted in 1381. Workers' unrest was the worst challenges to the Normans in the 300 years of their occupation. The main causes were an economy devastated by the Black Death, the 100 Years' War with France, and the huge tax burden levied to pay for the war. And in fact, it was this war that led to the return of bloodshed in Lewis. During the conflict, French ships regularly marauded along the Sussex coast. In 1372, one ship landed a war party and sacked the village of Rottingdean, only a few miles from Lewis. Feeding their oats, they sailed around to the River Ouse, raided Seaford, and boldly sailed up the river. Rottingdean belonged to Lewis Priory and was an important source of income. So the prior, much more belligerent than churchmen of today, took a war party of his own and rushed to defend the village. While his back was turned, the French reached the walls of the priory and attacked it. While a Cluniac priory practiced simplicity of life, it was loaded with treasures, a fact not unnoticed by the French. I've always called them vandals.
Well, we would certainly agree here at Lewis because they destroyed this most magnificent church. We had 2,000 beautiful manuscript books in our library. We know that was documented, and they were all ruined. The buildings were systematically destroyed over a very short period of time. So yes, we would say they were vandals. And the reason that the church was totally destroyed is because this was a very significant church. Since the dissolution, the buildings have been used for all sorts of different storage. People in Lewis have used the stone, taken the stone to build buildings throughout Lewis. Southover Grange is built entirely of stone from Lewis Priory. So if you look around Lewis, you will find little bits of the priory everywhere.
One of the things about fights in Lewis is that one side or the other were jolly well unsporting. The king heavily outnumbered de Montfort at the Battle of Lewis. And now the French had superior forces to the 200 English archers who were left to defend priory and town. The English fought bravely and gave the French a bad time. And in fact, they defended the priory successfully. But Lewis was sacked and burned before the raiders had finished. And they left with 3 hostages, including the prior. These 3 fetched a tidy sum before they were allowed back home. Barely had the town got back onto its feet than it suffered another bloody nose. The peasants' revolt in London had turned nasty, and the mob had broken into the Tower of London, killing several of the king's top men. These initial successes fanned the flames of unrest, and the rebellion spread, reaching Lewis. As the unrest spread, so did the control of its leaders. Large parts of England were invaded by rampaging and often drunken mobs. Whether the peasants who attacked and broke into Lewis Castle were true dissidents or drunken louts is hard to say. But their booty from the castle were barrels of wine. "63 pubs. Oh my goodness." Anyway, the authorities raised an army, went after the rebels, and mercilessly crushed the revolt. A subsequent uprising, for much of the same reason, again caught Lewis in its net. But although the violence spread, it didn't quite reach Lewis. Jack Cade, who hailed from Kent, whipped up a mob of middle-class country folk to try and break corruption in the court of King Henry VI in 1450. Cade's rural army invaded London, but after causing havoc, were driven out by a citizens' group angry at the looting by Cade's men. The rebels were put to flight, but not until they had murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cade fled London, but was caught just north of Lewes at the small town of Heathfield. Astonishingly, one of his supporters was the Prior of Lewes, who escaped unscathed. Poor Jack, however, was mortally wounded at Heathfield, taken back to London, hung, drawn and quartered, and had his head stuck on a pole on London Bridge. Smuggling began in Sussex as early as 1200. The villages surrounding Lewes were hotbeds of activity. Gangs of up to 500 men plied the illicit trade well into the 19th century. The trade was given a nod and a wink by the general public, sympathetic to the idea of cheap goods. But that changed as the gangs became ever more vicious and violent, and murders of customs officials became common. There is no doubt that smuggling took place in Lewes. After all, it was a port. But generally, the Lewes public supported the law, and it's recorded that they entered into pitched battles with the smuggling gangs. Tom Paine was a customs officer in Lewes, having been sacked in a previous post for turning a blind eye to smuggling. But his time in the job seems to have been without serious incident, and he was free to carry on his rebellious thoughts in the White Hart. Witchcraft is another favourite topic in the bars. Locals will look you in the eye and they'll tell you that evil spirits are brewed in Lewes, even to this day. Witchcraft in the town must be left to another day. But there is evidence that witch trials took place at Lewes Assizes. In 1565, a Marjorie Smythe of Battle was found guilty of witchcraft. She was charged with causing 2 toads to kill a cow. She was given a year in prison along with time in the pillory. 2 years later, a Newark lady, Agnes Baldwin, was found guilty of killing 2 pigs through witchcraft. There are also a couple of sillies to throw in. During this period, Henry VIII tried to stop rough footballing being played, despite the fact that every king from the 12th century onwards had failed to halt it. Oliver Cromwell banned the eating of mince pies on Christmas Day in 1654. He thought that gluttony distorted the human figure. Well, this isn't exactly a mince pie, but no, I'll leave it till later. But you know, that law is still on the statute books. Ho, ho, ho. Ding, dong, ding, dong. That's the sound of a church bell. But it's nothing like the ding-dong that went on for centuries over Lewes Assizes. The Assizes from Saxon times were situated in Lewes, and as Lewes had 2 mints and Chichester only 1, Lewes was the more important town. But the church put down its marker in Chichester, and so the town demanded that the Assizes should be located there. Lewes protested, and the court changed place several times. But they ended up back in Lewes for good. This is the present Lewes Crown Court. It has seen many famous cases over the years. Several leaders of the Irish Easter Uprising in Dublin of 1916 were held there. They included Eamon de Valera, later the Republic's first president, and Prime Minister. Probably the most famous murderer in the prison was John George Haig. He was known as the acid bath murderer. That's the way he tried to dispose of his victims. He appeared at Lewes Assizes in July 1949 and was found guilty in just 17 minutes. He was hanged by the then famous Albert Pierrepoint in August 1949. A notorious local murder in 1912 saw John Williams hanged in Lewes Prison. Williams shot a police inspector in Eastbourne, for which he paid the ultimate price. The notorious Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, were imprisoned in Lewes jail in the 60s. The colourful so-called celebrity gangsters managed to keep business going as usual while behind bars, hiring out protection teams to Hollywood stars. Frank Sinatra hired 17 of them from the Crays. No prison worth its salt can exist without at least one ghost, and Lewes is no different. Local gossip has it that one of the corridors is haunted by a man in Victorian-style prison garb. The most famous execution in Lewes, though, was that of Sarah French. She poisoned her husband with arsenic, cooked into an onion pie.
So much for the saying, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I was going to lounge around in these stocks all day until I heard about that onion pie. Now I think that I'll just have to leave and go to the pub. What are a few cabbages, though, and potato peelings and rotten eggs to a veteran journalist?
But that talk of poisoned pie has changed my mind.
I think I will pop in for a quick drink. I'm not so keen on being famous in Lewes for being a victim of crime. Lewes! Drink here I come.
Well, there's a bit of a background to Lewes in the past. We'll have episode 6 of this 8-part series at the beginning of next week. For the moment, let me just tell you about the Hawkhurst gang. Hawkhurst is just over the border in Kent. Nice little village. Had some friends live there and visited them on a couple of occasions. And enjoyed it. But it was where the gang of smugglers were located in the 18th century, the 1700s, who not only terrorized Sussex and the southeast of England, but also more or less governed it and ruled it. And it handed out summary justice to those people who tried to stand against them. They were said to be able to summon 150 men in no time flat, just almost at the flick of a wee. And they were notorious for raiding ships off the south coast and even managing to do false signals to them so that they ran them aground. There's some story that Tom Paine went after them, but no evidence. Now, I'm a great believer in hand-me-down tales and hand-me-down incidents and reports as at least a good guide to history. So I've no doubt that he did make some effort to chase some of the Hawkhurst gang. Melvin Bragg, the television expert on history, certainly said he claimed that Paine did do some chasing. But our Tom was a pretty canny character. The Hawkhurst gang turned on revenuers, as they were known, the customs officers, and in fact murdered several of them, which led to their demise. Whereas the public, grateful for cheap brandy, tobacco, and other good things, were more or less supported by the general public. And they, yes, if it means a bit of cheap goods, we'll turn a blind eye too. And so the Hawkhurst gang were able to operate at will. Their main headquarters was actually in Rye, and they were known to murder several people in Rye, taking on the army at Robertsbridge, ignoring the customs men, and really adding to the public turning against them was where they latched on to a so-called informer somewhere south of Chichester, picked him out in a pub, forced him outside, put him onto a horse back to front, and then, so that his feet were on the ground, and marched him up to Chichester, some miles away. And by the time the man got there, he was dead. And that appalled the average person. And again, the groundswell against Hawkhurst gang grew. But in their heyday, they were kings of the castle. There was no police as we know them in those days. Sir Robert Peel didn't become Home Secretary and didn't introduce legislation to create a police force known in the old days as peelers until the middle of the next century, the 1800s. And so the squires, with their own little private armies, the monasteries, the institutions with their own little private armies, were the only ones to stand up to the gang of smugglers, pretty ugly gang of smugglers, and they just weren't enough. The Hawkhurst gang were pretty well organized, and there is one story. Well, actually, there is a wonderful set of books by a chap called Tom Turner, not Tom Paine, Tom Turner, who lived in a small village in Sussex and who describes life there, and he acts as a sort of temporary magistrate, only to find that he owned a shop, and that somebody hauled before his court was somebody he'd been illegally buying goods from. A little tobacco here, a little brandy there. And when he realized it, he got a bad case of the whooping cough and couldn't sit as a magistrate because he would have been trying somebody that he had been illegally dealing with. His description of life in an English village in those days is absolutely fascinating. And is the vicar would party as hard as anybody else in the village. They would bet on things like cricket, and would get up to other hoop-de-doos, and he would come by horse into Lewes, go to the White Hart, would get so drunk he could barely sit on his horse before setting off back to his village. Is some considerable distance away. So life in that period was both dangerous because of the smugglers, hilarious because of the small village whoop-de-doo, interesting because of cricket gaining ground, and fascinating in as much as brand new thinking, such as that offered by Tom Paine and his Rights of Man and his teachings, if you want to put it that way, that eventually lost us the colonies and created a new nation, which has become the most powerful on earth. So the smugglers, the smuggling gangs, were very much responsible for the way that our nation, our way of life, our thinking changed. Vicious and nasty though they were, and never fool yourselves, is vicious and nasty are two words that really are very appropriate to these smuggling gangs. They didn't care. You got in their way, very much like the mafia of today, the North American mafia anyway. You get in their way, you had to be eradicated, eliminated. And that was the smuggling gangs of the 1700s. There is actually a description of how one group of villagers decided that they would stand up to the smuggling gangs. And the smuggling gangs said, we are going to attack you at such and such a date. If you won't bend to our wishes, we're going to attack you. And this is when we'll do it. And the villagers set up a defense, concealed themselves in the local church, and when the smugglers appeared, fought them. To say that the villagers won, it would be an overstatement, but they persuaded forcibly the smugglers to back off and go somewhere else, the easier pickings. So it was a very harsh life, a dangerous life, an interesting life. We tend not to think about history has a tendency to teach us in black and white. For instance, I went to a little village deep in East Sussex. Nice little village. Still got a lord of the manor. He still sat in a special pew in the small church. A very pretty little village. There's a memorial there to a number of people who died in 1065, 1066. Right, everybody knows, or should know, that 1066 was the date of the Norman conquest. And what I hadn't realized was that William didn't just attack. He didn't just wade ashore waving his sword, saying, "Hooray!" and for the French, or was that effect? He sent raiding parties ahead of time, and they weren't really raiding parties; they were commandos that turned up in the village, decided who was a threat, who might well join Harold and the Saxons to defend against the Normans. But once having identified them, it tried to rub them out. So there were raiding parties way before the actual invasion, preparing for the Normans to wade ashore eventually. All blurred at the edges. All blurred at the edges. Nothing straightforward, cut and dried. Fascinating history, the south of England, and particularly the southeast, where many of the raids took place. From Rottingdean, because there was no Brighton, through to Rye. It's a very historic town. And there were some pretty naughty things done. In each age, pretty naughty things. So when we actually take a look at evils perpetrated by nations and throw up our hands in horror, if you compare to a couple of centuries before, they don't seem as horrific as they might, or the centuries before were totally barbaric. But don't see them as heroic. Indeed, do not. Okay, now I'm going to take a little break. If you'll like to go and get a cup of coffee or a bun or a pint and have a little munch before we continue, please do. In the meantime, let's just go down to one historic site, which we do as our version of the Potter's Wheel. The way that the BBC in its early days filled the gaps between programs. We'll do the same thing, but with our own version of the Potter's Wheel, familiar to most of you. Now, let me remind you that this Sunday is the pub quiz in the Black Horse. It starts at 8 o'clock on Sunday. It's a couple of quid to enter, but you won't get any cheaper entertainment than that. And those people that come regularly to it say that it's a laugh a minute, a very jolly evening. It's good food, good beer, all on offer. And the quiz is a real mind bender. Also, every Sunday, starting at 12, we have the Sunday roast, the Black Horse, a marvelous Sunday dinner. Let's not leave it just yet. 4 roasts, all sorts of other things on offer. Beautifully cooked. The meat, well chosen and well presented. I have my Sunday lunch here most weekends. It's very nice. Better than nice. It's excellent. Now, we'll be back in 10 minutes or so. Where will we be back to?
From Lewis in the Black Horse pub.